Good day, friends, and welcome back to Bible Class Topics. Today we're studying Peter's first letter, and we're going to look at chapter 3, the first 7 verses. If you've missed any of the previous studies, I would suggest that you pause this video, click on the playlist in the description below, and go watch our previous videos. We have an introductory video as well as some studies over chapter 1 and chapter 2. Here's an overview of chapter 3. Peter continues giving instructions to classes or groups of people. He began this instruction back in chapter 2. Here we'll see him giving instructions to wives and husbands, and that will be today's lesson. In future lessons, he'll be giving instructions to the community of Christians, and then Peter will speak of the blessedness of suffering for righteousness' sake at the end of this chapter. A closer synopsis of the first 7 verses of chapter 3. Peter is continuing the 5th major subdivision of the study here in 1 Peter, entitled Submission to Authority. It started back in chapter 2, verse 13, and continues to chapter 3, verse 7. We've already studied governments and masters and the Christian's motivation to patiently endure suffering. And now in this lesson, we want to take a look at what Peter has to say about submission between wives and husbands in these 7 verses. We'll talk about the silent preaching of a lovely life, the true adornment, and the husband's obligations. Let's go ahead and read these 7 verses while we're on this screen. Likewise, wives, be subject to your own husbands, so that even if some do not obey the word, they may be won without a word by the conduct of their wives, when they see your respectful and pure conduct. Do not let your adorning be external, the braiding of hair and the putting on of gold jewelry or the clothing you wear, but let your adorning be the hidden person of the heart, with the imperishable beauty of a gentle and quiet spirit, which in God's sight is very precious. For this is how the holy women who hoped in God used to adorn themselves by submitting to their own husbands, as Sarah obeyed Abraham, calling him Lord. And you are her children if you do good, and do not fear anything that is frightening. Likewise, husbands, live with your wives in an understanding way, showing honor to the woman as the weaker vessel, since they are heirs with you of the grace of life, so that your prayers may not be hindered. The silent preaching of a lovely life. Peter has this to say in the first 2 verses. What do we do, he told his readers, if one spouse is a Christian and the other is not a Christian? Marital difficulties are bound to arise when one spouse is a Christian and the other is not. It is interesting that Peter gives wives 6 times more instruction than the husbands in this passage. 6 verses for the wives and 1 verse for the husbands. There's a reason for this. In the first centuries, 3 civilizations of the Roman Empire, women had no rights. No woman dared make any decision for herself. First, under Jewish law, a woman was basically a thing. Her husband owned her just like he owned his sheep, and she could never leave him, though he could dismiss her at any moment. It was unthinkable for a wife to change her religion while her husband did not. What about the Greeks? Well, the woman's duty was to remain indoors and obedient to her husband. One commentator said that writings from this time period express this: a good wife would see as little, hear as little, and ask as little as possible. She had no independent existence and no mind of her own, and her husband could divorce her for any reason, so long as he returned her dowry. and the Romans. Under Roman law, a woman remained as a child forever. She was born a child, and first she was under her father's power, and this gave the father the right to life and death over her. When she married, she passed into the power of her husband. She was entirely subject to her husband and completely at his mercy. So this was what was going on between husbands and wives in the first century around the Mediterranean part of the Roman Empire. Let's talk about what Peter did not advise these women to do. First of all, he did not advise her to leave her husband. This is exactly what Paul advised in 1 Corinthians 7:13 through 16, and I'll leave that for you to read. He did not advise her to leave her husband. Peter also does not tell the wife to preach, argue, or nag. And he does not recommend telling her husband there's no difference between slave and free, Roman and barbarian, or male and female. None of these things were advised by Peter in these verses. Well, what did he advise? He advised her to be a good wife. He says it's through the silent preaching of her lovely life that she will break down the barriers of prejudice and hostility and be able to win her husband to Christ. He suggests that she be submissive. If you don't know what New Testament submission is all about, I suggest that you stop the video and go study Ephesians 5, verse 21. We have a playlist that covers the entire letter of Ephesians, but we also have a 10-minute devotional concerning submitting to one another in the Lord. Peter follows Paul and advises submission. Peter calls for the wife to be voluntarily selfless. And this submission is based on a lack of pride and a desire to serve. It's not the submission of fear. It's the submission of perfect love. Peter advised the wife, the Christian woman whose husband is an unbeliever, to show him Christianity in her life by being submissive and by being chaste or being pure. The wife must live a life of purity and fidelity founded on love. Christian wives must lead exemplary lives, free from misbehavior or misconduct. This purity results from the observance of God's law and is not in just one area of behavior, but in every aspect of the woman's life. Submission, purity, and reverence. She must demonstrate to her husband that all life is lived in the presence of Christ. She must possess a reverent, wholesome respect for God. Her pure conduct will grow out of this healthy reverence and respect she has for God, and it will be reflected in her devoted observance of God's law. The true adornment, verses 3 through 6. Under view in this passage is how a female Christian may exercise a converting influence on her heathen husband. We can't lose track of that. It will not be through physical adornment. It will be through her spiritual excellence. We have to understand in these verses, Peter is not regulating the Christian woman's dress per se. Of course she may put on clothes. But the converting influence on her husband is to be exemplified through her excellent spiritual adornment. In the first century, as it is now, excessive interest in self-adornment is a sign, not only among women, but among men as well, that the person indulges in it has nothing more significant to occupy their mind than what they're going to wear. And here's a clickbaity title: The Haughty Daughters on the Judgment Day. Let's turn over to Isaiah 3 in our Bibles. I'm reading, as usual, here on the channel from the ESV. Let's talk about the haughty daughters on the Judgment Day, Isaiah 3. And I'm going to start back in verse 16. We'll read down to 24. The Lord said, because the daughters of Zion are haughty and walk with outstretched necks, glancing wantonly with their eyes, mincing along as they go, tinkling with their feet, therefore the Lord will strike with a scab the heads of the daughters of Zion, and the Lord will lay bare their secret parts. In that day the Lord will take away the finery of the anklets, the headbands and the crescents, the pendants, the bracelets and the scarves, the headdresses, the armlets, the sashes, the perfume boxes and the amulets, the signet rings and the nose rings and the festal robes, the mantles, the cloaks and the handbags, the mirrors, the linen garments, the turbans and the veils. Instead of perfume there will be rottenness, and instead of a belt a rope, and instead of well-set hair baldness, and instead of a rich robe a skirt of sackcloth, and branding instead of beauty. Of course, Isaiah is prophesying judgment that is going to come on Judah and Jerusalem. But when he mentions all of these adornments that women of that time would use, it's amazing just how many things are involved in this excessive interest in outward adornment. What would the haughty daughters of Zion lose in their day of judgment? They would lose everything. In the world of the Greeks and Romans, the women from families of means spent much time in their adornment. Why? They spent much time in their adornment because they were looking for a man. And they were looking for a man that would raise them up in their what am I trying to think of here? They were looking for a man that would raise them up in society, move them up a notch. That's what they wanted. They knew that if they were going to live, they had to have a man. That's just the way it was in the first century in the Roman world. Well, Christianity came forth into a world of abject poverty on the one hand, and these women didn't want to be there, and luxury and decadence on the other. There was no real middle class. Peter pleads for the graces which adorn the heart and are preciousness in the sight of God. Christian women need to adorn themselves as Sarah, the wife of Abraham, adorned herself. They need to adorn themselves with modesty, humility, and chastity, as we've already discussed. Only then will they be Sarah's daughters and within the family of the faithful people of God. Peter in no way is forbidding women to wear jewels or adorn themselves with modest apparel. He admonishes them to regard such things as worthless, though, compared to the graces that adorn the Christian character. It's those graces alone that determine one's worth in God's sight. Christian women must be willing to live a life of selfless service. They live that life in goodness and serene trust toward their husbands. Peter tells us that would be the best sermon they could preach. There are few other passages in the New Testament where the value of the lovely Christian life is so vividly stressed as here in 1 Peter 3, verses 1 through 6. What about the husband? Does he have obligations? Of course he does. And the first part of that obligation is reciprocity. All the responsibility is never placed on one side. If slaves have duties, then masters have obligations. If children have duties, then parents have obligations. Peter laid down the responsibility of wives in the first 6 verses, and now he lays down the responsibility of husbands. A marriage, in the eyes of God, must be based on reciprocal obligation. Peter has introduced a new concept into the ancient world. In the moral code of the Romans and Greeks, the wife had all the responsibilities and the husband had all the privileges. But the Christian ethic never gives a license without a corresponding obligation. Here are those obligations according to verse 7. First, understanding. The husband must be considerate and sensitive to his wife's feelings. Understanding and consideration will forge an unbreakable bond. Often, the cruelty which is hardest to bear is not deliberate, but the product of sheer thoughtlessness. The husband needs to be chivalrous, a word that doesn't come up in our vocabulary very often these days. He needs to be gallant. He needs to be brave. He needs to be loyal. The husband must treat the woman with courtesy. It was Christianity that introduced chivalry into the husband-wife relationship. Thirdly, the husband must understand that his wife is his spiritual equal. She is his fellow heir in Christ. Failure to meet these obligations places a barrier between a man's prayers and God. We can never expect our relationship with God to be correct if our relationships with our fellow men are wrong. To be one with God, we must be one with each other. In the relationships of wives to husbands and husbands to wives, only God-ordained behavior can give fullness, greater meaning and happiness, lasting satisfaction, and a blessed outcome to the parties involved. Christians should seek to follow God's instructions to secure themselves the blessings God has purposed for their relationship. Thank you for studying with me today. I hope these notes on Peter's first letter are helpful to you in your own personal Bible study. As I said, I'll put some links in the description below to some studies on submission that we have here on the channel. And just remind everybody that submission is not just for wives. It's not just for husbands. It's for all Christians. We hope to be back with you soon in the very near future, perhaps in a day or two, with another video. If you haven't subscribed to the channel and rung the notification bell, that will help you find out when new videos are posted. Generally, we post a new video on Sunday morning and also on Tuesday morning. Till we meet again, may God bless.